Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. A lot to get into. Very latest coming out of Israel. Both a extension of that temporary pause and also some indications of what is going to come next. So we'll get into all of that. We also have the White House panicking over so-called misinformation about the economy. Break that one down for you. Some behind-the-scenes details about what may have transpired that triggered the temporary firing of Sam Altman before he was brought back at OpenAI. Says a lot about the future of AI and the direction that that whole industry is going in. We also wanted to dig into those violent riots that unfolded in Ireland. It's quite shocking, and some of the untold details about what may have caused that outburst of anger and violence. So we'll get into that. Also, AIPAC apparently extremely desperate to get Rashida Tlaib out of office. You now have multiple candidates who say that they have been offered $20 million to fund a campaign against Rashida Tlaib coming from AIPAC-affiliated donors. To break that down for you, I've also got some news about what's going on at the RNC, not looking good in terms of their finances. Maybe they should talk to those other donors since there seems to be a lot of money flying around. And George Santos is going ham on his colleagues.
He's going out with a bang.
Yeah, it's sort of a Madison Cawthorn kind of vibes on
maybe
this
he's
one.
telling the truth this time, okay? This might be the most believable thing he has ever said. With all of that, though, before we get to that, we have our excellent merchandise that's currently on sale for the holiday season. We've got these cozy socks, which I wear all the time. But of course, we've got the sweater, we've got the ornament, we have the travel coffee mug, all of that, if you will, all of it available on shop.breakingpoints.com or at a link just from our website. And at the same time, as a thank you for everybody, and I know it's the holiday season, and this also includes existing premium subscribers who would like to gift a subscription. We are currently discounting our yearly membership at $90 a year, so go ahead and take advantage of that. All of that at breakingpoints.com. It helps support the show, helps really our expansion efforts. We're prepping, of course, for the 2024 election, which we're kind of in the middle of. A lot more new focus groups and other new ideas and cool stuff that we're able to bring to all of you. So any of those, buying merch or signing up for membership, giving a gift, any of those really does help us out a lot over here. But with that, let's get to Israel.
I also want to say shout out to Kurt, who was wearing a beautiful,
that's right. We
ugly
actually
sweatshirt
saw one in the wild
last night at Ryan Grimm's book event here in the city, and he looked fantastic in it. And yeah, it was fun to see.
I'm jealous because Kurt, you have a sweater before I have.
I know that's exactly what I said too.
I don't even have one.
It looked great on him though.
All right,
all right, let's go ahead and get to what is, of course, very serious news. I want to start with this, even though we do have the news about the ceasefire temporarily extended. We're going to break that down for you as well. But as a way to set the tone for this segment, we've been talking about how Netanyahu is under tremendous pressure. Basically, everyone in Israel wants him gone. He's just been trying to hold on by, the skin of his fingertips as long as he possibly can, delay any sort of accountability to try to maintain his grip on power. We now have a scoop. This is from Israeli media put this up on the screen, about the case he is making to his fellow Likud party members. Likud being, his right-wing party that he has been the head of for some time. He says he should stay in government because, quote, I'm the only one who will prevent a Palestinian state in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, which is the name that Zionists call the West Bank. He says, I'm the only one who can withstand U.S. pressure. He goes on to say it's because he knows Biden for 40 years, which has the ring of truth because Biden is so relationship-based, very similar to Trump in that way. And I know how to manage American public opinion. Now, keep in mind that consistently from the beginning of, this outbreak of conflict, the one thing that Biden has always said is, I'm committed to a two-state solution. Afterwards, we've got to get to a two-state solution. So here you have the head of government actively admitting at this moment, not only is he not interested in peace, he is making an affirmative case that they should keep him in power because he is damn sure and determined to make sure that Palestinians never have a state. So incredibly important context to keep in mind in terms of what may unfold in Gaza going forward, what the political dynamics are going to look like inside of Israel. And also, this is just thumbing the nose at the U.S. president at a time when we've provided them with unequivocal and totally unconditional support, including comments that there are no red lines for their operation here.
For me, that was the biggest takeaway because it's obvious, Bibi has said it many times before, about preventing Palestinian statehood, about how the Likud party and others should actually be hopeful that Hamas remains in power because that's the perfect cudgel to say that there's no reason we should move forward with the peace process.
Yeah.
But I thought the fact is that he's willing to say this to his own party to try and save his own skin at the very same time that he's not an idiot. He knows what we can't read or hit Google Translate. We obviously can see clearly about what is happening. Don't forget either, Krystal, we have a pretty good visibility apparently into Israeli spy networks because we had those Discord leaks, and one of the things that came out that from those classified files, which we reported on here on the show, was specifically about our visibility into Mossad and their efforts to try and thwart Bibi eventually coming back into power. So at a spy level, I'm almost certainly we're getting updates in the same way that we spied on the Ukrainians about like, hey, what are they actually saying to each other? And the fact that if it's now spilling out into the Israeli press about what the end state here, it just shows you how the fundamental long-term goal for Bibi Netanyahu and for the United States, and really I think anybody who is legitimately pro-Israel, is just diverging to a point where it has to be untenable. I mean, Bibi should have gone, I think, really the day after October 7th, or at the very least at the beginning of the war, to ensure real like coalitional support inside Israeli society and to give anybody who's pro-Israel in the U.S. the unequivocal support that they would want. But the issue is that while they have that, with the stated goal of U.S. policy going all the way back to Bill Clinton and honestly even before that, is a two-state solution. It has remained unchanged. Now, actionable-wise, it wasn't a priority under the Trump administration, the Biden administration, or the Bush administration. Let's all be honest. The same with Obama. But it still remains the thing that we're all supposed to be working towards. And if he is directly opposed to the desired end state as articulated by the American president and really by the American Congress, by all of the Western allies who are supportive of him so far, then why is he currently, getting the 100% support from the U.S. Congress and from that administration? So he's putting them in a place where, look, they can beat the drum of like, we support Israel's right to defend itself. I think that'll last up until the end of the war. But, eventually the bombs will end. Eventually, the military campaign has to come to a close. And at that point, if they're going to, already, while they're, John Kirby has said there are no red lines, Secretary Blinken has been like, there will be no mass expulsion from the Gaza Strip. There will be no, leaving to Egypt and never coming back. There will be no, mass deportation. They are going to remain in Gaza, and there will be a state. Now, we're a long way away from that, but that is the stated goal of U.S. policy. So for me, that's the big story, is that how he's laying it out that his only future is one directly opposed to U.S. policy and, in my opinion, U.S. interest, which it always has been, to have a two-state solution.
Well, I would also say it's counter to Israeli interest, given that, this direction of denying any sort of a state and propping up Hamas, has that led to security for the Israeli people? I think that's clearly has not worked in that direction. And, there's a lot to say about this because you always hear this rhetoric about how there's no partner for peace on the Palestinian side. And of course, that's always been the goal of Netanyahu and people on, on the right wing of Israeli politics, which is the majority of the Israeli public at this point and have, been dominating politics. They always say there's no partner for peace on the Palestinian side. And, that has some legitimacy, even though Hamas has now at points accepted the 1967 borders. But you can look at this as a terrorist organization, like all of that, that's fair, okay? But this is pretty clear. You don't have a partner for peace on the other side either. And there is such a fantasy version of Israeli politics that gets articulated by American politicians and American press. This is not a surprise. This has been Netanyahu's goal for years and years and years. He's stated it plainly. The continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Just ask that settler that Isaac Chotiner interviewed that we covered here in the show. And she said, yeah, the settlements are because we don't want a Palestinian state. And she goes on to say, it's very simple to understand. It is very simple to understand because the more you expand those illegal settlements, the more impossible it makes it to ever envision a Palestinian state. The more you build up Hamas and the more you keep the Gaza Strip and the West Bank separate, the more that you make it impossible to have a Palestinian state. That has always been the goal of Netanyahu. That has always been the goal, even more so, of his coalitional partners who are, in a lot of ways, this is something that Daryl Cooper of Martyr Made says.
Yes.
The right wing of Israeli politics has always been more honest, honestly, than the left-wing or liberal part of Israeli politics. They're very upfront about this as a settler colonial project. Very upfront about, what we ultimately want to see is Gazans expelled from the Strip and a final solution for us to take back all the land. They're quite upfront about their goals. And here in the U.S., American politicians just put their thumbs in their ears and pretend like they're not hearing it and pretend we still live in this fantasy land of the Oslo Accords and a quote unquote peace process.
Yeah, so that's actually, I think the big problem is most Americans, as usual, have a Disney-fied version of basically anything that goes on abroad.
Yeah,
if you want to look to what's going on in Israel, maybe you should ask people who live in Israel. If you actually want to go to Israel, you maybe shouldn't go on an AIPAC guided tour or your birthright. Sorry to break it to you, just going on birthright doesn't mean you actually know that much. You probably should spend some time there. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I spent a decent amount of time, and I actually know people who live there and also have spoken to a pretty wide array. And then also you look to people who have spent years and years of their life, and what quickly emerges is a very dynamic, complex, politically very split, even religiously split in many cases, and ethnically split society, which is why it is always so difficult to describe Israel as a single polity. It's both a Jewish state, it's a sovereign state, it's an economic miracle, but it's also a security nightmare, at least for the United States and for the Israeli people. So to break it down, really, I think this is what Daryl also brings out from the Martyr Made podcast, is he's like, look, the biggest issue is that you have these very small factions of the Israeli right and of the Palestinian right who have always at every turn resorted to violence at critical moments to derail the peace process and inflame the tensions. And that is a deeply unfortunate reality. And it reminds you of the power of these single incendiary, even fringe eras of society, which are able to use this violence to then flare things up to a level where they make it politically impossible. You can also read the Hamas attacks in that same vein, which is Hamas and the Palestinians were realizing, and the PA, everybody was open and honest about this, that the Abraham Accords and the normalization of relations between the Gulf Arab states and Israel was an existential threat because it meant that the Arab states would no longer even pretend that Palestinian statehood was a political priority for them. So what did they do? They carried out this heinous political attack. They inflamed the tensions of the Gulf monarchies and of the actual populations, which are way more pro-Palestine. And let's be real, pro-terrorists than the actual Gulf monarchs. And so now the monarchs are stuck in a place where they're like, we can't normalize relations. Our people hate you. And so to have them in a scenario where they're normalizing relations and there's bilateral agreements and all that stuff, not even just in secret, but out in the open, impossible now, probably for a generation at this point. So you have to always remember what the meta context of this is, and that's where moving towards a Palestinian statehood, and at least if you wanted to make that the goal, I think you would conduct your military operation very, very differently. And same with the U.S., part of why we are just stuck in such a rock and a hard place between our domestic political support for Israel and the geopolitical reality of what the future on the ground there is going to look like.
You can't lock people in a cage for decades and think there's not going to be some sort of response. And there have been attempts at, everybody always said, oh, where's the nonviolent Palestinian resistance? I mean, there have been real attempts at that. The Great March of Return that happened that was met with, sniper fire and people being killed and massacred and their legs shot. That was a genuine grassroots attempt in Gaza at nonviolent resistance. And so you can't think that you're going to lock people in what has been described by many as an open-air prison and what has been described by some as a concentration camp and think that there's not going to be a response. Now, as to the U.S., and I do want to get to the immediate news here in a minute, Biden likes to feign, they're leaking to the press, oh, they're really trying behind the scenes, he's really pressing Bibi and he's giving him a hard time about X and Y and Z and trying to push more aid and et cetera, et cetera. This leak also reveals that any sort of gains that have been made here in terms of the hostage deal and the temporary ceasefire, this didn't have anything to do with us. This was all because of domestic political pressure and the grassroots movement and the energy of the families of the hostages and the pressure that they applied from day one saying, hey, my family members are in Gaza and we have to bring them home. That's what he was responding to. And then the other piece of this is, all this feigned impotence. Oh, well, we asked him really nicely, we're really trying behind the scenes. Yeah, but you're not willing to do the one thing that would matter, which is to say, no, you're not getting our weapons, you're not getting our money. We are going to, we're not going to provide you endless diplomatic cover at the UN unless you conduct this operation in a way that is consistent with trying to achieve Palestinian statehood and with trying to achieve the minimal amount of civilian casualties possible. But instead, not just the words, but the deeds have been no red lines and unconditional support. The Intercept had a piece about how we lifted all the restrictions on our weapons stockpile. There's normally a process that involves, real supposed careful determination of what weapons goes to whom, trying to ensure that they're not going to be used against civilians. All of that completely lifted in this conflict. Let me go ahead and get to the very latest in the news. As I mentioned now a couple times, there has been, put this up on the screen, a 2-day extension of the ceasefire as additional hostages are released. Qatar said mediators had secured that deal to prolong the temporary truce by 2 days. The U.S. is welcoming that extension and said it would like to see the pauses extended further beyond the additional 2 days. You guys will probably remember the deal here. It was initially 50 hostages for 150 Palestinians who were being held in Israeli prisons. For every additional 10 hostages that Hamas was able to locate and release, they were going to extend the pause for an additional day. The hostages, they go on to say here, releases have received near wall-to-wall media coverage inside of Israel, while thousands of Palestinians have gathered each evening outside of Ofar prison between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, letting off firecrackers to celebrate the prisoners' release and bolstering Hamas's political standing. So this is the absolute focus of attention right now in Israel. But again, to this question, the U.S. is getting a little uncomfortable, you might say, with the level of civilian death and atrocities that have been committed here. And so there's a push for let's extend the ceasefire as long as possible. But the Israelis are very clear that this is not the end of their bombing campaign. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, go ahead and put this up on the screen, says that it will be bigger, the fighting when it resumes will be bigger and take place throughout the Gaza Strip. Quote, the enemy will meet first the bombs of the Air Force and after the shells of the tanks and the artillery and the scoops of the D9 bulldozers and finally gunfire of the infantry troops. We will fight in the entire Strip. So, of course, the initial bombing campaign was throughout the entire Strip, but concentrated on the northern part of Gaza, which has now been effectively completely destroyed and rendered uninhabitable. People were told to flee to the south. They're now being told to move to what is a very small part of the south for this planned expansion of the bombing campaign. As they've now said, Hamas leaders have moved to the southern part of the Strip and located in Khan Yunis. So that is the plan for the military campaign going forward. Effectively no end in sight as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, that's right. And this just kind of brings us back to what we're talking about in terms of the political realities of the future. If we can put the next part, please, up on the screen. Can the Palestinian Authority really govern Gaza after the war? This was written by Stephen Erlinger. He's a fantastic reporter. I've followed him for many, many years. He's a foreign correspondent, currently working over at the New York Times. But what I think he hits on correctly is that Abbas, the PA, have never had less political legitimacy than at this time. That the goal from 2005 onward to establish the PA as a legitimate governing authority, mostly propped up by the United States and the international community, not really by the actual Palestinian people, and then docilely accepted-ish by the Israeli government, has actually made it so that the entire generation that's grown up under them feels as if they are not advocating for their interests and are instead either puppets or props of the West and or docile companions of the Israelis, which I can understand.
I was going to say, I don't think they just feel that way. I think that is the reality.
I'm only describing how they would put it in the kindest possible way. The problem, and this was the dream really of Oslo, to have legitimate political representation, and then the falling apart of that dream, 2005 really onward, has made it so that the U.S. dream of simply installing some sort of PA government over the Gaza Strip really bears any question of whether the population would accept it, because many of the Gazans who now have been through this horrific ordeal, and while they may not support Hamas, and in fact, there's a lot of indication about Hamas support and all of that it's not nearly as ironclad as everybody says. Everyone's like, oh, well, they voted him in 17 years ago. I'm like, yeah, well, it's been 17 years, and they've also been rife with corruption. They've siphoned off aid for themselves. They've enriched themselves to the tunes of millions of dollars and built all of these tunnels. The population, arguably, nobody has suffered more than the actual Gazans who have lived under Hamas rule, many of whom are not fundamentalist Islamic, they're not fundamentalist Muslims either. This is a very, very different population. So put all of that aside. They are, and any sovereign nation wants legitimate political representation.
Yeah.
And that is just where the big question of what can operationalize the wants and the needs and the desires of these 2.2 million, which is acceptable to them and also acceptable to the international community. And it just does not appear to be what the Palestinian Authority is. And then you run into the same Iraq problem where any authority which is deemed acceptable to the West and or to Israel is automatically seen as a puppet that will have no actual governance capability. And then people either don't show up to the elections or they support, Islamic terrorism like the Sunnis did in Iraq, and they had no legitimacy in terms of the Iraqi elections. And then the only legitimately elected Iraqi leaders end up being people who are hopelessly corrupt and can only stay in power by giving the finger to America, even though they're the ones who pay all of their bills. We ran into this with Karzai in Afghanistan and his eventual successors. We ran into this over basically every person who ruled over Iraq all the way up until today. I think we're running into the same problem right now with Palestine.
The PA basically cooperates with the Israeli security. And so in the West Bank, where you have, repeated settler incursions and violence pushing Palestinians off their land, and the people who are supposed to represent there are nowhere in sight to protect them from this. Like, of course, how are they going to feel about that? And so you do have this dichotomy of, you'll see some polls that are like, oh, Palestinians overwhelmingly support Hamas. And then you'll see other indications, as you're pointing to, Saagar, that's like, actually, no, they're very frustrated with Hamas because of their failures of governance and just like basic, ability to live your life and, be able to get food and a job for your family, et cetera. Well, those are basically their only two political options, putting aside a lot of smaller parties. So you've got either Fatah, which is, PA and is effectively an Israeli collaborator, or you've got Hamas. I thought this article was really interesting because they actually talked to Palestinians about how they view the political situation. They spoke with a housewife, a 30-year-old housewife from Ramallah, that's in the West Bank, asked if the Palestinian Authority could run Gaza. She said, absolutely not. The PA is just sitting, she said, with many years without elections. The one who does for the people should be in charge of the people, she added, referring to Hamas. They also talked about the reason that Hamas gained support. Because if you look at, support for violent resistance versus, more moderate forces throughout Palestinian history, what you see is when peace is being negotiated and it's a legitimate possibility, you see support for the armed violent resistance plummet when there's an actual prospect of real peace. So this article points out the failure to reach a negotiated peace has made the other obvious alternative, that of armed Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation, more acceptable and popular. Go on to quote a moderate Palestinian who is the president of Al-Quds University. From the Palestinian point of view, he said, October 7th looked like a miracle. This fortress Israel suddenly seemed vulnerable. This professor goes on to say that he abhors the violence that was perpetrated, but was clear about the impact. Who is Palestinian leadership now? It's Hamas, like it or not. At the moment, Hamas is seen by Palestinians as the foremost representative of Palestinian interests. And why? Because no one else is. The PA does not figure in people's minds. Another prominent Palestinian pollster said in his latest survey, not yet published, 66% of Palestinians in the West Bank regard the PA as a burden. These are the people that we want to put in charge of everybody. Right. Everyone already hates them. Some 85% want Mahmoud Abbas, who is the head, to resign, and that means more than 60% of his own rank and file in Fatah want him to go. So what they're saying is that one of the only possible, potential political solutions would be an agreement to disarm Hamas and actually bring them in as part of a more legitimate governing coalition, because the PA has no legitimacy whatsoever, and that's all that is left. And in fact, if you put this next piece up on the screen, there are Arab leaders who are trying right now to get Hamas to lay down their arms. They're saying, listen, you stand no chance. You may as well lay down your arms now before you are destroyed. And they also suggested that should Hamas disarm, they could join the leadership of the PLO as a purely political party. So this is an active conversation. There's one other piece, Saagar, that I want to mention before I get your reaction to all of this, which is, a lot of people say, oh, who could be the head? who has legitimacy among the Palestinian people, who's a possible leader here. And the person that I keep seeing brought up is Marwan Barghouti, who is right now being held in Israeli prison because of his involvement with the Second Intifada. But this is someone who has, unlike Mahmoud Abbas, he is not Hamas, and he has widespread support and legitimacy among the Palestinian people. So if you're actually serious about a potential, post-war government, he would seem like a logical potential choice.
The problem with all this is it makes sense on paper. And if you were to ask me how this will eventually end up decades from now, it'll probably look like this. The issue is that through all of human history, it's the bitterest pill on earth to swallow, to look a man in the face who's tried to kill you and who ordered people who you know's death. And the only really way to get there is a ton more death. And I don't condone it, but that's the reality. For the Israelis to accept something like that, they are gonna have to go through a brutal occupation regime. They're gonna have to exhaust every other possibility.
We would have to effectively force it.
We would have, even if we force it, I'm not sure they could accept it at this current moment, or even in the next year or even 2 years. The memories of October 7th are just gonna be too big to swallow. But 20 years from now, in the same way the US commanders who spent their entire careers trying to kill the Taliban eventually found, imagine, an insane situation where you have the commander of CENTCOM, whose entire job was to kill Taliban, then on the phone with the Taliban negotiating an exit from Kabul. That's a surreal moment, but honestly, that's mostly how those things end up. Even in the First World War, if you ever look at any sort of negotiated solution where you don't have unconditional surrender, it just takes like millions and millions of people to die for people to even entertain the possibility of sitting across from people who have tried to kill you in the past. Obviously, that's really unfortunate. However, though, in the same way that those conflicts were easily foreseen as how they would eventually end up, this one also just seems very, very obvious to me. It just seems that politically it's going to be incredibly difficult. It would take America to force it, and it would take Israel honestly suffering a tremendous loss, either in soldiers or in economic costs, and possibly both, before they could entertain it. And of course, Netanyahu would have to be long, long gone before you could get to it, which is part of why I think it's, it's even worse, because you just know how much of a Gordian knot that this is going to remain. And around, I think, all of international politics for honestly decades to come.
Well,
I don't see how it can end.
Unfortunately, I agree with you that it seems impossible to imagine that out of this we actually get a peace process, we actually get a two-state solution and rights for Palestinians. But there's also no doubt in my mind that even if you just care about security for Israelis, that's the direction things should go in, because you can't keep people locked up. You can't keep them in this apartheid system in the West Bank with settler violence and continued incursions on their land. You can't keep the indefinite blockade. You can't keep destroying them and mowing the grass in these horrific wars and think that this is going to provide peace and security for your own people. At the same time, there's new reporting about internal dissent within the White House about the way that they have provided unconditional support to Israel, both publicly and through their actions, as we were saying before. This was a really interesting and revealing piece of reporting. Put this up on the screen from the Washington Post. They start off by talking about how earlier this month, a group of about 20 distressed White House staffers requested a meeting with Biden's top advisors. The diverse group had three main issues they wanted to discuss, and this was with White House Chief of Staff Jeff Zients, Senior Advisor Anita Dunn, Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner. They wanted to know the administration's strategy for curbing the number of civilian deaths, the message it plans to send on the conflict, and its post-war vision for the region. The aides, they say, listened respectfully, but participants felt that they fell back on familiar talking points and basically did nothing to alleviate their concerns in this private meeting. There's some interesting details here about why Biden has gone in the direction that he's gone, and it harkens back to what Bibi was saying about, hey, I've known this guy for 40 years, I can control him, don't worry about it, that's why you gotta keep me in place. Biden went and visited Israel back in 1973 and met with then Prime Minister Golda Meir. And at the time, Israel was a very different state politically. It was basically left-leaning. It was, much less of a sort of military behemoth than it is now. Now it is this incredibly right-wing state with the occupation more vicious and brutal than it's ever been. But he still has this nostalgic view of his trip there and meeting with Golda Meir. So that's part of, I mean, it's classic Biden,
Yes.
right? That's part of why.
I'm laughing, but it's not funny.
Yeah, right. Yeah. He has not updated his view since 1973, is basically the view that you come away with. Biden aides are admitting that this is kind of a disaster. The division inside the White House is to some degree between Biden's senior longtime aides, they say, and an array of younger staffers of diverse backgrounds. But even top advisors say they recognize the conflict has hurt America's global standing. Quote, "We are taking on a lot of water on Israel's behalf." So even the people who are most inclined to back Biden's support of this war on Gaza, even they know this has been really bad for us. And there's one other piece here that I wanted to lay out that got a lot of attention. You guys might remember Biden called into question the death counts coming out of Gaza and, you know, really trying to undermine the idea that there's been just mass civilian death in this indiscriminate bombing campaign, including 70% women and children who've been killed here. Apparently, he has, they say at times, wrestled with his own emotions regarding the war. On October 25th, he voiced skepticism about that Gaza death toll. He says, "I have no notion about that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed." The very next day, Biden met with 5 prominent Muslim Americans who protested what they saw as his insensitivity to the civilians who were dying. All spoke of people they knew who had been affected by the suffering in Gaza, including a woman who had lost 100 members of her family. And he appeared to be affected by their account. He said, "I'm sorry, I'm disappointed in myself." He told the group, according to 2 people familiar with the meeting, "I will do better." The meeting was supposed to be 30 minutes, ended up lasting for an hour. So even behind the scenes, even he admitted that he was wrong to call into question the rate of civilian death that is unfolding in Gaza.
Well, I mean, the thing is instead of trusting the Gaza Health Ministry or any of that, we have just looked to what Israeli sources are saying. And the Israelis are like, yeah, it's between 10 to 20,000. That's what the Israeli military says.
Right.
So even if you don't believe them, you should believe the others. And you know, my thing is, I instinctually am going to distrust most of what is put out by either of these parties. But one of the things that reporting-wise was Ryan Grimm just going and checking the names of people who were claimed dead and then going, I think that's actually a journalistic possibility.
Right. And the other thing
not sure why more people hadn't looked into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, leave it to Ryan to
just
be like,
let
me just actually check. Oh, turns out it was accurate. If anything, it was understating the deaths. And you can also look at past conflicts where the same Gaza Health Ministry run by Hamas was accurate, more or less, in their counts. So, you know, we have history to judge by. So in any case, it shows you that even within the White House, despite their bluster and their continued insistence on like staying the course with unconditional support, even the people who most support this direction know that in terms of world standing and in terms of the politics, it's been an utter disaster.
Yeah, well, you know, referencing earlier book that I had here and the work of John Mearsheimer, he called all of this a long, long time ago. He's actually done a couple of podcasts. I'm working on trying to get it.
Yeah, we'd like to have.
I really would like to
sure.
have him sit with him because he was a big influence on my thinking around this subject and has basically on every subject for a long time.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.